The will is a forgery. Lady Eleanor's words sliced through the courtroom like a blade, her pale eyes fixed on Lydia with the promise of absolute destruction. Jonathan's mother had already hired witnesses to paint Lydia as a gold-digging manipulator, had already vowed to bury the inheritance in litigation for decades. But she didn't know about the letter, the one Jonathan wrote 4 days before his death, the one that would turn her attack into her own annihilation. The question was, would Lydia be strong enough to survive long enough to use it? If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The scent of 3 centuries of polished oak. Cold marble and fading lavender hung heavy in the air of the East Wing reception room, a space where only family gathered, and where Lydia Farnell was now pointedly placed. She stood near a window that overlooked the manicured gardens, the same ones where the light had been so golden on the day Jonathan proposed. Today, the late afternoon sun was pale and unforgiving. Her dress, the deep blue silk Jonathan had gifted her, felt like a target against the cold neutrality of the Rutledge estate looming behind her, a structure that had been a silent, powerful judge of her unworthiness. Lydia smoothed the skirt of her gown, the gesture revealing her trembling hand. Her only comfort was the sleeping weight of Elias in the next room, a 1-year-old child whose very existence was a source of public shame and private grief. Jonathan was gone, a victim of a riding accident a month prior, and she was utterly alone, save for the son his family called a bastard. Her mind replayed Lady Eleanor Rutledge's last words to her. "You took our son from us. Do not mistake grief for opportunity. You will receive nothing." She hadn't expected anything. She only prayed for the dignity to mourn. The creak of the door announced the lawyer, Mr. Ainsworth, a man as rigid and old-fashioned as the manor itself. He carried a small, sealed document, Jonathan's last will. His gaze on Lydia was cold, professional, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "Mrs. Farnell Rutledge," he began, his voice dry. "I am here to read the final will and testament of Mr. Jonathan Rutledge." Lydia braced herself, her small goal simply to endure the reading with quiet grace. Accept the inevitable pittance for Elias's basic needs and retreat. She didn't look at the portrait of Jonathan hanging over the fireplace. She couldn't. Mr. Ainsworth cleared his throat and opened the envelope, the sharp tear of paper echoing in the silence. He read the legal preamble, then, without inflection, delivered the sentence that would destroy the Rutledge family's future and reverse Lydia's fate. "To my son, Elias Farnell Rutledge, I hereby bequeath the entirety of my personal wealth, property, and the remainder of the Rutledge inheritance." The air thickened, and the sudden, silent shift in the power dynamic was palpable. Lydia, the poor woman they disowned, was suddenly the reluctant custodian of their lost fortune. The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of war. Lydia's breath caught, her hand instinctively reaching for the windowsill to steady herself. She had heard Mr. Ainsworth speak, had registered the formal cadence of his voice, but the meaning felt impossible, too large, too devastating, too final. Mr. Ainsworth continued, his tone unchanged, as if he were reading a mundane contract rather than dismantling the foundations of one of England's oldest dynasties. Including the estate of Rutledge Manor, all associated properties in Kent and London, the investment portfolios managed under the Rutledge Trust, and all personal effects, holdings and titles transferable by law. No other provision is made for any surviving member of the Rutledge family, save a singular bequest of £100 to Lady Eleanor Rutledge, in acknowledgment of her role as my mother. £100. The insult was precise, deliberate, and utterly devastating. Lydia's vision blurred. She forced herself to breathe, to remain upright, to not crumble beneath the weight of what Jonathan had done. He had not merely provided for Elias, he had waged a final, silent rebellion against the family that had cast them both out, that had called their love a disgrace, and their son illegitimate. Mr. Ainsworth adjusted his spectacles and turned a page, his expression as impassive as stone. There is a codicil, dated 3 days prior to Mr. Rutledge's death, which I shall read in full. Lydia's gaze flickered to him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. To my beloved Lydia, Mr. Ainsworth read, and for the first time his voice faltered, just slightly, a crack in the veneer of professional detachment. I know you will believe yourself unworthy of this. I know you will feel the weight of their judgment and think yourself small beneath it. You are not. You are the only person in my life who ever saw me as a man, not as an heir, not as a title, not as a transaction. Elias is my son, my blood, my legacy. But he is yours to raise, yours to protect, yours to love. The fortune is his by right, but you are his mother, and that makes you stronger than any Rutledge who ever lived. Do not let them take this from you. Do not let them take him. I love you beyond the grave, beyond their cruelty, beyond every rule they tried to bind me with. Jonathan. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lydia felt tears slide down her cheeks before she could stop them, hot and unbidden. She turned her face toward the window, unwilling to let Mr. Ainsworth see her break, but it was too late. The grief, the love, the impossibility of Jonathan's final act, it was too much. He had known. He had known exactly what his family would do, how they would react, and he had left her not merely money, but a weapon. He had armed her with his fortune and his words, and in doing so had made her untouchable. Mrs. Farnell Rutledge, Mr. Ainsworth said quietly, and there was something softer in his tone now, something almost human. As the mother and legal guardian of the sole heir, you are named as the primary custodian of the estate until Elias reaches his majority at 21. All decisions regarding the management, sale, or administration of the properties and holdings now rest with you. Lydia turned slowly, her tears still wet on her face, and met his gaze. With me, with you, he confirmed. The will is legally airtight. I prepared it myself under Mr. Rutledge's explicit instructions. He anticipated resistance. Resistance. The word was a polite mask for the fury that would come, the legal siege, the social ruin the Rutledge family would attempt to visit upon her. Lady Eleanor would not accept this. She could not. To do so would be to admit that her son had chosen a poor, disowned woman, and her so-called bastard child, over the entire weight of his bloodline. What happens now? Lydia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Ainsworth closed the will with a quiet snap. Now, Mrs. Farnell Rutledge, you go home. I will file the will with the appropriate courts and notify the family of its contents. I expect you will hear from Lady Eleanor within the day. Home. The word tasted strange. She had no home, not really. The small cottage she rented on the edge of the village was barely large enough for her and Elias. A place she could afford only because of the modest savings Jonathan had secretly given her before his death. But now, legally, absurdly, Rutledge Manor was her son's home, which meant it was hers. She nodded, unable to form words, and moved toward the door. Her legs felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath her had shifted, and she had yet to find her footing. "Mrs. Farnell Rutledge." She paused, her hand on the door frame, and glanced back. Mr. Ainsworth regarded her with something that might have been respect. "He was very certain of you. I suggest you be certain of yourself." Lydia stepped into the corridor, the heavy door closing behind her with a final, resolute thud. The manor stretched out before her, vast, cold, and utterly hostile. Somewhere within it, Lady Eleanor was waiting, unaware that her world had just been overturned by the last will and testament of the son she had tried to control. Lydia clutched her shawl tighter and walked toward the nursery where Elias slept, innocent and unaware that he had just inherited an empire, and that his mother had just become the most dangerous woman the Rutledge family had ever faced. Lydia had barely reached the nursery door when she heard the sharp click of heels on marble, a sound she had come to recognize with a particular dread. She turned, her hand still on the door handle, and saw Lady Eleanor Rutledge sweeping down the corridor like a storm given human form. The matriarch was impeccably dressed, as always, her black morning gown severe and unforgiving, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the already harsh lines of her face, but it was her eyes that stopped Lydia cold, pale, glacial, and blazing with a fury so intense it seemed to distort the very air around her. "You!" Lady Eleanor hissed, the single word dripping with venom. "You dare to remain in this house!" Lydia's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet the older woman's gaze even as her instinct screamed at her to look away, to apologize, to shrink. "Mr. Ainsworth advised me to—" "I do not care what that fool advised you!" Lady Eleanor snapped, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. She stopped mere inches from Lydia, her presence suffocating, her rage a physical force. "Do you have any comprehension of what you have done? What poison you whispered into my son's ear? To make him commit this obscenity?" Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. "I did nothing. Jonathan made his own—" "Do not speak his name." The command was so cold, so absolute, that Lydia's words died in her throat. Lady Eleanor's lip curled in disgust. "You are a leech, a common, grasping creature who saw wealth and title and sank your claws into a boy too naive to see you for what you truly are." The words struck like blows, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to erase. Lydia felt her composure slipping, the familiar shame rising up to choke her. This was what she had always feared, that they were right, that she had been foolish to believe Jonathan's love could ever be enough to bridge the chasm between their worlds. Lady Eleanor stepped back slightly, her expression shifting from fury to something colder, more calculated. "The will is a forgery." Lydia blinked, the accusation so unexpected that for a moment she couldn't process it. "What?" "You heard me," Lady Eleanor said, her voice sharp as a blade. "My son would never disinherit his own family for a bastard child, and the woman who bore him. The document is a forgery, procured through bribery or coercion or whatever sordid means you employed. I will have it overturned." "It is not a forgery," Lydia said, her voice trembling but firm. "Mr. Ainsworth—" "Mr. Ainsworth is complicit, clearly," Lady Eleanor interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "But it matters little. I have already retained the finest solicitors in London. They will tear that will apart, line by line. And they will expose it for the fraud it is. And when they do, you will be cast out of this house with nothing but the shame you brought upon yourself." Lydia felt her breath quicken, panic rising in her chest. Litigation, court battles, the weight of the Rutledge family's wealth and influence brought to bear against her, a woman with no connections, no power, no resources beyond what Jonathan had left. They could drag this out for years, decades even, ensuring that Elias never saw a penny of his inheritance. Lady Eleanor smiled, a thin, cruel expression that held no warmth. "But I am not without mercy. Unlike you, I do not savor cruelty." She reached into the small reticule at her wrist and withdrew a folded piece of paper, holding it out toward Lydia. £5,000. Enough to set you up comfortably in some distant corner of the country where no one knows your name or your disgrace. You will sign a document relinquishing all claims to the Rutledge estate on behalf of yourself and the child. In return, you will have enough money to live quietly and leave this family in peace. Lydia stared at the paper, her mind reeling. £5,000. It was more money than she had ever imagined possessing, more than her father had earned in his entire life. It would be enough to rent a proper house, to educate Elias, to live without fear of destitution. But it would also mean surrendering everything Jonathan had fought for. It would mean admitting that she was what they had always claimed, unworthy, grasping, small. "Take it," Lady Eleanor said, her voice soft now, almost kind. And that kindness was somehow worse than her rage. "Take it and go. You do not belong in this world, girl. You never did. Jonathan's infatuation was a tragedy, but it does not have to define the rest of your life. Walk away." Lydia's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. It would be so easy, so simple. She could take the money, take Elias, and disappear. She could avoid the courtrooms, the public shame, the brutal scrutiny that would come if she fought. And then she thought of Jonathan's words, read aloud in Mr. Ainsworth's dry, formal voice. "Do not let them take this from you. Do not let them take him." Her hands stilled. She looked up, meeting Lady Eleanor's gaze, and for the first time she saw something flicker in the older woman's eyes. Uncertainty. "No," Lydia said quietly. Lady Eleanor's expression froze. "What did you say?" "No." Lydia's voice was stronger now, steadier. "I will not take your money, and I will not relinquish Elias's inheritance." The matriarch's face twisted with rage, the mask of civility shattering. "You foolish, ignorant girl. Do you truly believe you can fight me? I will bury you. I will tie this estate in litigation until that bastard child of yours is old and grey. You will spend every penny you do not have on solicitors and court fees, and in the end, you will lose everything." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not look away. "Perhaps, but it will be his choice to make when he is old enough, not yours and not mine." Lady Eleanor stared at her, breathing hard, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. For a long moment the corridor was silent save for the distant ticking of a clock. Then the matriarch turned sharply, her skirts whipping around her ankles. "You will regret this," she said, her voice cold and final. "I promise you that." She swept away, disappearing down the corridor, leaving Lydia alone, trembling and terrified, but still standing. 3 days after her confrontation with Lady Eleanor, Lydia received a note. It arrived not through the formal channels of the Rutledge household, but slipped under the door of the small cottage where she and Elias had retreated, a place that felt safer than the suffocating grandeur of the manor. The handwriting was precise, the paper plain, nothing that would draw attention. It read simply, "I must speak with you regarding your son's inheritance. Please meet me at the UN Chapel of St. Barnabas at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Come alone. A friend." Lydia read it 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. It could be a trap, a ploy by Lady Eleanor to gather evidence of some imagined wrongdoing. Or it could be something else, something she desperately needed. Information. Help. an ally in a world that had turned entirely hostile. She left Elias with Mrs. Daventry, the kind widow who lived next door, and made her way to the chapel as the afternoon light began to fade. St. Barnabas was old, small, and largely forgotten, tucked away on the edge of the Rutledge estate where the manicured gardens gave way to wild woods. It was a place Jonathan had loved, a place where they had sometimes met in secret before their marriage. The thought of him tightened her chest, but she pushed it aside. She could not afford to break, not now. The chapel door creaked as she stepped inside. The air was cool and still, scented with old wood and candle wax. A single figure stood near the altar, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the stained glass. Mrs. Farnell Rutledge. The voice was young, male, and edged with urgency. Lydia moved closer, her eyes adjusting to the shadows. The man was perhaps 25, tall and lean, with dark hair and earnest eyes that studied her with something she hadn't seen in days, respect. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her distance. "My name is Robert Ashford," he said, his voice low. "I was a junior solicitor in the employ of the Rutledge family. I worked under Mr. Ainsworth until 2 days ago, when I was dismissed." Lydia's wariness sharpened. "Why were you dismissed?" Robert hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "Because I refused to participate in what they are planning to do to you." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Lydia felt her breath catch. "What are they planning?" Robert glanced toward the door, as if ensuring they were truly alone, then stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "Lady Eleanor has retained a firm from London, Hartwell and Cask. They are known for their ruthlessness, particularly in matters of inheritance disputes. Their strategy is already in motion." "Tell me," Lydia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "They intend to challenge Elias's parentage," Robert said bluntly. "They will claim that there is no legal proof that Jonathan Rutledge is the father of your child. Without such proof, the will becomes invalid, as Elias would have no legitimate claim to the inheritance." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Lydia's feet. She reached out, her hand finding the edge of a pew to steady herself. But Jonathan acknowledged him. He named him in the will. A will written by a man allegedly influenced by a woman of questionable character, Robert interrupted, his tone bitter. "That is how they will frame it. They will paint you as a manipulator, a seductress who ensnared a vulnerable, grieving man and convinced him to name a child, any child, as his heir, in order to gain access to the fortune." Lydia felt sick. "Jonathan and I were married. Privately, yes. But legally, do you have the marriage certificate?" The question was gentle, but it struck like a blow. Lydia's mind raced. The marriage had been conducted by a retired vicar in a village 30 miles away, a man Jonathan had known and trusted. They had been so careful to keep it secret, to avoid the family's wrath until Jonathan could find a way to make them understand. The certificate had been kept in Jonathan's personal papers, locked in his study at the manor. Papers that were now entirely under the control of Lady Eleanor. I don't have it," Lydia whispered. "Jonathan kept it. He said it would be safer." Robert's expression tightened with sympathy. "Then they will claim the marriage never occurred. That Elias is, in the eyes of the law, illegitimate." The word was a knife. Lydia closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe, to think. Why are you telling me this? If you were dismissed, why risk coming here? Robert was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I knew Jonathan. Not well, but well enough to see that he was a good man, trapped in a family that valued legacy over love. When he came to Mr. Ainsworth to draft the will, I was the one who took his dictation for the codicil. I saw his face when he spoke of you and Elias. He was not a man being manipulated. He was a man ensuring that the people he loved would be protected. Lydia opened her eyes, tears blurring her vision. What can I do? I have no resources, no connections. I cannot fight them. You can, Robert said firmly. But you need proof. You need the marriage certificate or some other documentation that establishes Elias's legitimacy beyond doubt. Without it, they will destroy you in court. The certificate is in the manor, Lydia said, despair creeping into her voice. Lady Eleanor will have destroyed it by now. Perhaps, Robert admitted. But Jonathan was careful. He was many things, but careless was not one of them. If he truly feared his family's reaction, he may have made copies or left evidence elsewhere. Where? Robert shook his head. I don't know. But I can help you look. Quietly. Carefully. Lydia studied him, searching his face for deception, for hidden motives. She found only sincerity, and something else, an anger, perhaps, at the injustice of what he had witnessed. Why would you help me? She asked. You owe me nothing. No, Robert agreed. But I owe Jonathan the truth. And I owe myself the ability to sleep at night. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small card, handing it to her. This is where I am staying. If you decide you want my help, send word. But do it quickly. The legal proceedings will begin within the week, and once they do, it will be much harder to maneuver. Lydia took the card, her fingers brushing his. Thank you, she whispered. Robert nodded, then turned and walked toward the side door of the chapel, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Lydia stood alone in the silence, clutching the card, and for the first time since Jonathan's death she felt something other than grief and fear. She felt the faintest fragile spark of hope. Lydia sent word to Robert the following morning, and by that evening they had formed a plan, one that required both courage and deception in equal measure. The problem was simple. Anything that might prove Elias's legitimacy would be found in Jonathan's personal effects, most of which remained locked in his private study within Rutledge Manor. Lady Eleanor had barred Lydia from entering the estate, and the staff had been instructed to turn her away on sight. But Robert, despite his dismissal, still had contacts within the household, servants who had liked Jonathan, who whispered their doubts about the family's treatment of the young master's widow. It was through one of these contacts, a housemaid named Clara, that they learned Lady Eleanor would be away for 2 days, travelling to London to meet with her solicitors. The manor would be lightly staffed, the study unguarded. It was a narrow window, and a dangerous one. Lydia arrived at the servants' entrance just after midnight, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might give her away. The door opened soundlessly, and Clara's pale face appeared in the dim light of a single candle. Quickly, the girl whispered, ushering Lydia inside. Robert was already waiting in the shadows of the scullery, dressed in dark clothes that made him nearly invisible. He nodded to Lydia, his expression tense but determined. The study is on the 2nd floor, east wing, he murmured. We have perhaps 2 hours before the night steward makes his rounds. They moved through the manor like ghosts, keeping to the servants' corridors and back staircases. Lydia had walked these halls before, but always in daylight, always as a guest, however unwelcome. Now, in the darkness, the house felt malevolent, as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting to betray her. They reached the study without incident. Robert produced a key. Borrowed, he said, from Clara, who had taken it from the housekeeper's ring, and unlocked the door. It swung open with a faint creak that sounded deafening in the silence. Jonathan's study was exactly as Lydia remembered it, lined with books, smelling of leather and tobacco, dominated by a heavy oak desk that faced the window overlooking the gardens. She felt a wave of grief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. This was his space, his sanctuary. She could almost see him sitting at the desk, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he wrote, his grey eyes lifting to smile at her when she entered. "Lydia." Robert's voice was gentle but urgent. "We need to search quickly." She nodded, forcing herself to move. They began methodically, Robert taking the desk while Lydia examined the bookshelves and cabinets. Jonathan had been organized, but he had also been secretive when necessary. If he had hidden something, it would not be in an obvious place. Minutes stretched into an hour. They found letters, old account books, sketches Jonathan had made of the estate, but nothing that proved the marriage, nothing that established Elias's legitimacy beyond doubt. Lydia's hands trembled as she searched, panic rising with each empty drawer, each unmarked envelope. "There has to be something," she whispered, more to herself than to Robert. Robert paused, frowning at the desk. He was careful, methodical. If he truly feared his family would challenge the will, he wouldn't have left the only proof in an easily accessible place. Lydia closed her eyes, trying to think as Jonathan would have thought. Where would he hide something precious, something that needed to be protected but also eventually found? Her eyes snapped open. The books. Robert looked up. What? He loved books. He always said they were the one thing his family never understood about him. She moved to the shelves, scanning the titles. Most were legal texts, history, philosophy, the sorts of volumes expected in a gentleman's study. But there, on the third shelf, was a small collection that stood apart. Poetry. Lydia's breath hitched. Jonathan had given her a volume of poetry on the day he proposed, an old copy of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese. He had inscribed it with a line she had memorized. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." Her fingers found the spine of the same volume here on his shelf. She pulled it free and immediately felt that something was wrong. It was too light, too hollow. She opened it. The center had been carefully cut away, creating a small hidden compartment. Inside were 3 items: a folded piece of parchment, a small photograph, and a sealed letter addressed in Jonathan's handwriting to Mr. Ainsworth, to be opened only in the event of a legal challenge to my will. Lydia's hands shook as she lifted the parchment and unfolded it. The words swam before her eyes, but she forced herself to focus. Marriage certificate. Jonathan Edward Rutledge and Lydia Ann Farnell, witnessed by the Reverend Thomas Hensley, dated the 14th of May, 1886. "Robert," she breathed. He was at her side in an instant. He took the certificate, holding it up to the candlelight, examining it closely. It's legitimate. The vicar's seal, the signatures. This is legal proof. Lydia pulled out the photograph next. It showed her and Jonathan on their wedding day, standing outside the small country church. She was in a simple white dress, he in his best suit, and both of them were smiling with a joy so pure it made her chest ache. On the back, in Jonathan's handwriting, "Mr. and Mrs. Rutledge, the happiest day of my life." The letter she left sealed. That was for Mr. Ainsworth, and she would not violate Jonathan's trust. "We have it," Robert said quietly, wonder and relief mingling in his voice. "This is everything we need." Lydia carefully returned the items to the hollowed book, clutching it to her chest. The proof of her marriage, the proof of Elias's legitimacy, the proof that Jonathan had loved them enough to defy his entire family. It was all here, hidden in the pages of poetry. A sound from the corridor froze them both, the distant tread of boots on marble. "The steward," Robert hissed. "We need to leave. Now." They extinguished the candle and slipped out of the study, Robert locking the door behind them with trembling hands. They retraced their steps through the darkened manor, every creak of the floorboards a potential betrayal, every shadow a threat. Clara was waiting at the servants' entrance, her face white with fear. "Hurry," she whispered. "He's early tonight." Lydia and Robert slipped through the door and into the night just as the steward's footsteps echoed down the hallway behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the estate, where the manicured grounds gave way to wild fields. Only then did Lydia allow herself to breathe. She looked down at the book in her hands, at the proof it contained, and felt tears of relief and grief stream down her face. "We have it," she whispered. "We can fight them now." Robert nodded, his expression grim but hopeful. "Now the real battle begins." The courtroom smelled of old wood, ink, and the faint metallic tang of anxiety. Lydia sat in the witness box, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. The room was smaller than she had imagined, but it felt cavernous, every surface hard and unforgiving. Above her, a narrow window let in a shaft of pale morning light that illuminated the dust motes hanging in the air like suspended judgment. She had worn the blue dress again. It was the finest thing she owned, and she needed its armor today, needed the memory of Jonathan's hands fastening the buttons, his voice telling her she looked like she belonged in any room she entered. She had not believed him then. She did not believe it now, sitting beneath the scrutiny of barristers, clerks, and the public gallery packed with spectators eager to witness the scandal of the season. Lady Eleanor sat in the front row, a vision of controlled fury in black silk, her face a mask of aristocratic disdain. Beside her were the Rutledge solicitors from Hartwell and Cask, men with sharp eyes and sharper tongues who had spent the past week preparing to dismantle Lydia's life piece by piece. Mr. Ainsworth sat on the opposite side, grave and composed, with Robert beside him taking notes. They had the marriage certificate, the photograph, the sealed letter, but the hearing had been called to address the challenge to Elias's legitimacy, and that meant Lydia would have to speak. She would have to expose herself, her history, her heart, to a room full of strangers who had already decided what she was. The magistrate, a stern man with silver whiskers and wire-rimmed spectacles, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Farnell Rutledge, you have been called to provide testimony regarding your relationship with the late Mr. Jonathan Rutledge and the parentage of the child named in his will. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Speak up, please," the magistrate said, not unkindly. She swallowed and tried again. "Yes, sir." The lead barrister for the Rutledge family, a man named Mr. Cornelius Blackwell, rose from his seat with the deliberate slowness of a predator. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and his smile was polite in the way a knife was polite. "Mrs. Farnell Rutledge," he began, his tone smooth. "Or should I say Miss Farnell? After all, the legitimacy of that title is precisely what we are here to determine, is it not?" Lydia felt the sting of the implication but forced herself to remain calm. "I was legally married to Jonathan Rutledge on the 14th of May, 1886. "So you claim," Blackwell said, pacing slowly before the witness box. "But let us establish some context for the court, shall we? Tell us about your family, Miss Farnell. Your father's occupation, for instance." She felt the trap closing, but had no choice but to answer. "My father was a clerk. He worked for a shipping company in Portsmouth." "A clerk," Blackwell repeated, as though the word itself were distasteful. "And your mother?" "She took in sewing to supplement the household income." "I see. And you yourself? Did you work before your association with Mr. Rutledge?" "I was employed as a companion to an elderly woman in the village, Mrs. Penrose." Blackwell nodded thoughtfully, as though piecing together a puzzle. "A companion. A respectable position for a girl of your station, certainly. And it was in this capacity that you first encountered Mr. Jonathan Rutledge, was it not? Yes. Lydia's throat tightened. Mrs. Penrose was a distant relation of the Rutledge family. Jonathan visited her occasionally. How convenient, Blackwell said, his voice dripping with insinuation. And how quickly did you recognize the opportunity such an acquaintance presented? I did not, Lydia began, but he cut her off. You were poor, Miss Farnell. Your family lived in a rented cottage, your father's income modest at best. Surely the prospect of a connection to one of England's wealthiest families must have been appealing. Lydia felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her voice steady. I did not pursue Jonathan. He pursued me. Of course he did, Blackwell said with a thin smile. A young, impressionable gentleman, far from the scrutiny of his family, meets a pretty girl who listens so attentively. How could he resist? There was a murmur from the gallery. Lydia clenched her hands tighter, her nails digging into her palms. Tell me, Miss Farnell, Blackwell continued, when did Mr. Rutledge first propose marriage? In the spring of 1886. And did he inform his family of this engagement? No, Lydia admitted. He wanted to wait until he could present them with a fait accompli, Blackwell interrupted. A secret marriage, followed swiftly by a pregnancy, leaving his family no choice but to accept you. That is not how it happened, Lydia said, her voice rising slightly. Then how did it happen, Miss Farnell? Blackwell's tone sharpened. Did you or did you not conceive a child out of wedlock? The room went silent. Lydia felt every eye on her, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical force. She thought of Elias, asleep in Mrs. Daventry's care, innocent of the cruelty being wielded in his name. I conceived my son after Jonathan and I were married, she said clearly. We were married in May. Elias was born the following March. Blackwell smiled as though she had just confirmed his point. A marriage conducted in secret, in a village 30 miles away, with no family present and no public announcement. Convenient, is it not, that the only proof of this union is a certificate that has only now surfaced? It surfaced because Jonathan hid it, Lydia said, her voice stronger now. He hid it because he knew his family would destroy it if they could. He knew they would do exactly what you are doing now, try to erase me, erase our marriage, erase our son's right to be acknowledged. There was a stir in the courtroom. Blackwell's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. You speak of rights, Miss Farnell. But what right does a child born of a union his family knew nothing about have to an inheritance that has been built over generations? Lydia looked directly at him, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she felt the fear recede, replaced by something fiercer. The right given to him by his father. Jonathan loved Elias. He acknowledged him. He provided for him. That is not my doing. That is Jonathan's choice. And you may tear apart my character, my history, my motives, but you cannot tear apart the fact that Jonathan chose us. He chose his son. The magistrate leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. In the gallery, Lydia saw a reporter scribbling furiously, and another watching her with something that looked almost like respect. Blackwell's jaw tightened. No further questions, Your Honor. Lydia stepped down from the witness box on unsteady legs, but she held her head high. She had spoken not for herself, but for Elias, and for the first time, she believed that might be enough. The second day of the hearing began with a shift in the air, something cold and calculated that Lydia felt the moment she entered the courtroom. Lady Eleanor sat in her usual position, but there was a different quality to her stillness now, the coiled satisfaction of a snake about to strike. Robert leaned close as Lydia took her seat. Something is wrong, he whispered. They have added 3 witnesses to their list, names I do not recognize. Lydia's stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means they are changing tactics. His voice was grim. Be prepared. The magistrate called the court to order, and Mr. Blackwell rose with the same predatory grace he had displayed the day before. But today his confidence seemed sharper, more assured. "Your Honor," he began, "the defense has questioned the character and motives of Miss Farnell at length. Today we intend to provide the court with testimony from individuals who knew her prior to her association with the late Mr. Rutledge. Testimony that will illuminate the true nature of her designs." Lydia's breath caught. She scanned the room and saw them now. 3 figures seated near the back, 2 women and a man, all dressed respectably, all wearing expressions of somber duty. She did not recognize any of them. The first witness was called. A woman in her middle years, plain-faced and neatly dressed, took the stand and gave her name as Mrs. Judith Carmichael. "Mrs. Carmichael," Blackwell began smoothly, "how did you come to know the respondent, Miss Farnell?" "I was acquainted with her mother, sir," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "We lived on the same street in Portsmouth for several years. And during that time, did you have occasion to observe Miss Farnell's behavior and character?" Mrs. Carmichael hesitated, as though reluctant to speak, then nodded slowly. "I did, sir. I regret to say that even as a young girl, Lydia showed troubling tendencies." Lydia felt the words like a slap. She had never seen this woman before in her life. "Troubling in what way?" Blackwell prompted. "She was always very aware of her appearance, very conscious of the attentions of men. There were rumors, even then, that she had set her sights on bettering her station through unconventional means." "Unconventional means," Blackwell repeated. "You are suggesting she sought to use her feminine charms to secure a wealthier future?" "I would not presume to judge, sir," Mrs. Carmichael said with false modesty. "But there was talk. Her mother was quite concerned about it." Lydia's hands clenched in her lap. Her mother had been dead for 5 years, unable to defend herself against these lies. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Mr. Ainsworth rose to cross-examine, his expression tight with controlled anger. "Mrs. Carmichael, you say you lived on the same street as the Farnell family. What was the address?" The woman blinked, caught off guard. It was Marlow Street, sir." "Marlow Street," Mr. Ainsworth repeated. "And during what years did you reside there?" "From 1878 to 1883, approximately." "I see. And can you describe the Farnell residence?" Mrs. Carmichael hesitated. "It was a small cottage, sir. Red brick, as I recall." "Red brick?" Mr. Ainsworth's tone was cutting. "Your Honor, the Farnell family never resided on Marlow Street. They lived on Chapel Lane, in a whitewashed cottage with a blue door. This witness is either mistaken or lying." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Carmichael's face flushed, but Blackwell was already on his feet. "A simple error of memory, Your Honor, regarding a street name from over a decade ago. It does not invalidate the substance of her testimony." The magistrate frowned but nodded. "Noted. Proceed." The second witness was worse. A man named Mr. Gerald Hooper, who claimed to have worked alongside Lydia's father at the shipping office. He testified, with great reluctance and performative sorrow, that Lydia had once visited the office and had been observed flirting shamelessly with the manager, a married man of considerable wealth. "She made it quite clear what she was after," Mr. Hooper said, shaking his head. "Her poor father was mortified. He told me privately that he feared his daughter would bring scandal upon the family." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. Her father had been a gentle, quiet man who had loved her fiercely. To hear his name invoked in service of these lies was almost unbearable. Mr. Ainsworth attempted to dismantle Hooper's testimony as well, pointing out inconsistencies in dates and details, but the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted. In the gallery, Lydia could see the reporters writing, their expressions no longer sympathetic but speculative, hungry for a more salacious story than a tragic romance. The third witness was the cruelest. A young woman, barely older than Lydia herself, who gave her name as Miss Anne Pritchard. She claimed to have been employed alongside Lydia as a companion in Mrs. Penrose's household. "Miss Pritchard," Blackwell said gently, "can you describe Miss Farnell's behavior during her employment with Mrs. Penrose?" The girl looked down at her hands, the picture of reluctant honesty. "She was ambitious, sir. She spoke often of wanting more than her station allowed. When Mr. Rutledge began visiting, she made sure she was always in his path. She would arrange to be in the garden when he arrived, or in the drawing room when he called. It was deliberate." "Did she ever speak to you about Mr. Rutledge directly?" Miss Pritchard nodded slowly. "Once, sir. She told me that a man like Mr. Rutledge could change a girl's entire future. She said that if she played her role correctly, she would never have to work another day in her life." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lydia felt the room tilt, felt the walls pressing in. She wanted to scream that it was a lie, that she had never said any such thing, that there had never been another companion in Mrs. Penrose's household. But her voice seemed trapped in her throat, smothered by the weight of the accusations. She looked desperately at Robert, who was already scribbling notes, his face pale with fury. Mr. Ainsworth rose to object, to cross-examine, but Lydia could barely hear him over the roaring in her ears. The girl on the stand was lying. They were all lying, but they sounded so convincing, so earnest, so detailed. And Lydia had no proof, no witnesses of her own to counter them, no way to prove that these people were strangers hired to destroy her. When the court finally adjourned for the day, Lydia stumbled out into the corridor on shaking legs. Robert caught her arm, steadying her. "They are lying," he said urgently. "Every one of them. We will prove it, Lydia. We will find out who paid them, and it does not matter," Lydia whispered. Her voice sounded hollow, distant. "Even if we prove they are lying, the damage is done. The court has heard it. The press has heard it. Everyone will believe I am exactly what they said. A scheming, manipulative girl who trapped a nobleman. Lydia, I cannot do this." The words came out broken, almost inaudible. "I cannot stand there and listen to them tear apart everything Jonathan and I had. I cannot watch them turn our love into something sordid and calculated. I cannot—" Her voice broke entirely, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. She had thought she was strong enough for this. She had thought Jonathan's love and her determination to protect Elias would be enough to carry her through. But she had not anticipated this. The systematic destruction of her character, the lies delivered with such conviction that even she almost believed them. Robert gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You can do this," he said fiercely. "You must. For Elias. For Jonathan. Do not let them win, Lydia. Do not let them take this from you." But as she looked past him and saw Lady Eleanor emerging from the courtroom, triumph written in every line of her cold, elegant face, Lydia felt her resolve crumble to dust. Lydia did not return to the courtroom the next morning. She could not. The thought of sitting beneath those vaulted ceilings, of enduring another parade of hired liars, of watching the magistrate's expression shift from neutrality to doubt, it was unbearable. Instead, she remained in the small cottage, sitting at the window with Elias on her lap, watching the morning light filter through the curtains, and wondering if she had the strength to continue. Robert arrived just past 9, his face drawn with concern. He knocked twice before letting himself in, finding her exactly where she had been when the sun rose. "Lydia," he said quietly, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. "The hearing has been postponed until tomorrow. Mr. Ainsworth requested additional time to prepare a rebuttal to yesterday's testimony." She did not look at him. "There is no rebuttal, Robert. How do I prove that people I have never met are lying? How do I counter testimony that sounds so detailed, so convincing?" "We find the truth," Robert said firmly. "We investigate these witnesses, find out who paid them, expose the connection to Lady Eleanor." "It will take weeks," Lydia interrupted, her voice flat. "Perhaps months. And even if we succeed, the doubt will remain. The story is already written in the minds of everyone who heard them. I am the scheming girl who trapped a nobleman. That is what they will believe." Robert was silent for a moment, his jaw tight with frustration. Then he said quietly, but with absolute conviction, "Jonathan did not leave you defenseless, Lydia. He knew his family better than anyone. He would have anticipated this." Lydia finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "What do you mean?" "The letter," Robert said, standing abruptly. "The sealed letter we found in the book, the one addressed to Mr. Ainsworth, to be opened only in the event of a legal challenge." Lydia's breath caught. In the chaos of the past days, she had nearly forgotten it. They had delivered it to Mr. Ainsworth along with the marriage certificate and photograph. But the seal had remained intact. Jonathan's instructions had been explicit. "Has he opened it?" she asked. "I do not know," Robert admitted, "but a legal challenge has been mounted. The conditions have been met." He reached for his coat. "We need to see him. Now." They found Mr. Ainsworth in his chambers, a cramped office above a stationer's shop that smelled of old paper and sealing wax. The elderly lawyer looked up as they entered, his expression grave. "Mrs. Farnell Rutledge," he said, rising. "I was about to send for you." Lydia's heart hammered. "The letter. Have you opened it?" Mr. Ainsworth gestured to his desk, where the envelope lay, its seal broken, the pages spread out before him. "I opened it this morning, after yesterday's testimony. I felt the conditions Mr. Rutledge specified had been unequivocally met." "What does it say?" Robert asked, stepping forward. Mr. Ainsworth picked up the letter, his hands steady despite the weight of what he held. "Perhaps it is best if I read it to you directly." He cleared his throat and began. "To Mr. Ainsworth, in the event that my family seeks to challenge my will or to discredit the legitimacy of my marriage or my son's parentage, I write this in sound mind and clear purpose. I know my family. I know their capacity for cruelty when their pride and their legacy are threatened. I know they will not accept Lydia or Elias, not because they are unworthy, but because accepting them would require admitting that I chose love over duty, happiness over heritage. They will never forgive me for that choice, and they will punish those I love if given the opportunity." Lydia felt tears slip down her cheeks, Jonathan's voice so clear in the formal words that it was as though he were in the room with them. Mr. Ainsworth continued, "Therefore I have included within my will a secondary provision, known only to you and activated only by the act of contestation. It is as follows. Should any member of the Rutledge family, or any party acting on their behalf, legally challenge the terms of my will, question the legitimacy of my marriage to Lydia Farnell, or seek to disprove the parentage of my son Elias, the entirety of my estate, including Rutledge Manor, all properties, investments, and assets, shall be immediately placed into an irrevocable trust. This trust shall be managed solely and exclusively by Lydia Farnell Rutledge, with no oversight, consultation, or input from any member of the Rutledge family, until such time as Elias reaches his majority at the age of 21. At that time, the estate shall pass fully to him. The room went utterly silent. Robert stared at Mr. Ainsworth, his mouth slightly open. Lydia felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Do you understand what this means?" Mr. Ainsworth said, looking at her intently. "By contesting the will, Lady Eleanor has triggered the very mechanism designed to strip her of any remaining influence. She has not merely failed to disinherit Elias, she has ensured that you, the woman she sought to destroy, will have sole and absolute control of the Rutledge fortune for the next 20 years. Lydia sank into the nearest chair, her legs unable to support her. He planned this. He knew they would fight. He knew, Mr. Ainsworth confirmed, and he ensured that their fight would be their undoing. He turned the page. There is more. He continues, I do this not out of spite, though I confess my family has earned my anger, but out of love. Lydia will protect Elias in ways my family never could. She will raise him to value character over title, compassion over legacy. She will teach him that love is not a weakness, but the greatest strength a man can possess. I trust her completely, and in doing so, I defy every rule I was raised to follow. Let this letter stand as proof that my choices were deliberate, informed, and made in full knowledge of the consequences. I regret nothing. The final words broke something in Lydia. She covered her face with her hands and wept. Not from despair this time, but from the overwhelming force of Jonathan's love, his foresight, his final brilliant act of defiance. He had known the battlefield better than anyone, and he had armed her with the one weapon his family could never counter, their own pride. Robert crouched beside her chair, his voice thick with emotion. They have lost, Lydia. The moment they challenged the will, they lost everything. Mr. Ainsworth folded the letter carefully. I will present this to the court tomorrow. The hearing will become a mere formality. Lady Eleanor's legal challenge has activated the trust provision, and there is nothing she can do to reverse it. The more she fights, the more thoroughly she ensures her own defeat. Lydia lowered her hands, her face streaked with tears but her eyes clear for the first time in days. She thought of the courtroom, of Lady Eleanor's cold triumph, of the lies told with such conviction. She thought of the reporters scribbling their sordid stories, the magistrate's doubtful frown, the weight of the world's judgment pressing down on her. And then she thought of Jonathan, sitting in his study just days before his death, writing this letter with steady hands and a breaking heart, ensuring that even from beyond the grave he would protect the people he loved. Tomorrow, she said quietly, her voice steady now, unshaken. We go back tomorrow, and we end this. Robert smiled, fierce and proud. Tomorrow, we end this. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the final day of the hearing. Word had spread through London society like wildfire. The scandal of the Rutledge will had become the most talked-about spectacle of the season. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the air thick with anticipation and the rustle of fine fabrics as ladies leaned close to whisper behind gloved hands. Lydia sat beside Mr. Ainsworth and Robert, her hands folded in her lap, her blue dress pressed and immaculate. She had slept the night before, truly slept, for the first time since Jonathan's death. The knowledge of the letter, of Jonathan's final provision, had settled in her chest like a warm stone, anchoring her against the storm she knew was coming. Lady Eleanor sat across the aisle, regal and composed in black bombazine, her solicitors flanking her like sentries. Mr. Blackwell stood at the ready, his expression confident, almost smug. He believed he had won. The testimony of the previous days had done its work, casting doubt on Lydia's character, painting her as a calculating social climber who had manipulated a vulnerable man. The magistrate entered, and the room rose as one before settling back into tense silence. He surveyed the courtroom with a weary expression, clearly eager to bring this matter to a close. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the barristers, "I trust we can conclude this hearing today. Mr. Blackwell, you may present your final arguments." Blackwell rose smoothly, arranging his papers with deliberate care. "Your Honor, the testimony presented over the past days has painted a clear picture. Miss Lydia Farnell, regardless of the certificate produced, was a woman of humble origins who saw an opportunity in the late Mr. Jonathan Rutledge and pursued it with singular determination. The so-called marriage certificate, conveniently discovered only after the will was contested, is suspect in its timing and provenance. Furthermore, the will itself was drafted without the knowledge or consent of Mr. Rutledge's family, during a period when he was clearly under the influence of this woman's charms." He paused, letting the words settle. "Your Honor, we do not dispute that Mr. Rutledge may have had genuine affection for Miss Farnell. Young men are often led astray by pretty faces and persuasive words, but to allow a fortune built over 3 centuries to pass into the hands of a child whose legitimacy remains questionable, based on a will written in secret, this would be a grave injustice." Lady Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Lydia saw the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Blackwell continued, "We ask the court to set aside the will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of proper familial consultation. The Rutledge estate should rightfully pass to the surviving members of the family, as tradition and law would dictate." He sat down, and the magistrate turned to Mr. Ainsworth. "Your response, Counselor?" The elderly lawyer rose slowly, his age apparent in the careful way he moved, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He looked at Lady Eleanor for a long moment before speaking. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "my learned colleague has spoken eloquently about tradition, about family, about the proper order of things. But he has failed to address one fundamental truth. Jonathan Rutledge was a free man, of sound mind, who had every legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. The question of undue influence remains," the magistrate said, frowning. "Indeed it does," Mr. Ainsworth agreed, "and I will address it directly." He reached into his case and withdrew the letter, still in its envelope, Jonathan's handwriting clearly visible on the front. "Your Honor, I hold in my hand a letter written by Jonathan Rutledge to me personally, dated the 18th of March, merely 4 days before his tragic death." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Blackwell was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. If such a document existed, it should have been presented earlier." The letter was sealed with specific instructions. Mr. Ainsworth interrupted calmly. "It was to be opened only in the event of a legal challenge to the will. That condition has been met." He looked at the magistrate. "With the court's permission?" The magistrate leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Proceed." Mr. Ainsworth broke the seal. Though Lydia knew it had already been opened, he had carefully resealed it for this moment, and withdrew the pages. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as he began to read. Jonathan's words filled the space, clear and deliberate, outlining his fear of his family's reaction, his certainty that they would challenge the will, his explicit instructions about the trust provision. With each sentence, Lydia watched the colour drain from Blackwell's face. Lady Eleanor had gone very still, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. When Mr. Ainsworth reached the clause about the irrevocable trust, the provision that granted Lydia sole control of the entire estate the moment the will was contested, the courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to write, spectators gasped and whispered, and Blackwell turned to Lady Eleanor with an expression of dawning horror. The magistrate banged his gavel. "Order! I will have order!" The noise subsided, but the shock remained palpable. Mr. Ainsworth continued reading until he reached the final lines. Jonathan's declaration that he regretted nothing, that his choices had been made in full knowledge and with absolute conviction. When the lawyer finished, he carefully folded the letter and looked directly at Lady Eleanor. "Your Honour, by contesting this will, Lady Eleanor Rutledge has activated the very provision designed to prevent her interference. The estate is no longer merely bequeathed to young Elias. It is now held in an irrevocable trust, managed exclusively by Mrs. Lydia Farnell Rutledge until the child reaches his majority. No member of the Rutledge family has any claim, any oversight, or any legal standing to challenge this arrangement." Blackwell was on his feet, his composure shattered. "Your Honour, this cannot be legal. Such a provision is entirely legal," Mr. Ainsworth said coldly. "I drafted it myself, at Mr. Rutledge's explicit instruction. It is airtight, witnessed, and filed with this court as part of the original will documentation." The magistrate took the letter, reading it himself with meticulous care. The silence stretched, agonizing, and absolute. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. "This document appears genuine and legally binding. Mr. Rutledge's intent is unmistakable." He turned to Lady Eleanor, who sat frozen, her mask of composure finally cracking. "Lady Rutledge, by contesting your son's will, you have forfeited any remaining claim to influence over his estate. The trust provision is now in effect." Lady Eleanor rose slowly, her face ashen. "You cannot. This is my family's legacy." "It was your family's legacy," the magistrate corrected quietly. "Your son chose to leave it to his son. And you, madam, by refusing to accept his choice, have ensured that his widow, the woman you sought to destroy, now holds complete authority over everything you sought to reclaim." The words landed like blows. Lady Eleanor turned to look at Lydia, and for the first time there was no fury in her eyes, no contempt, only the hollow devastation of utter defeat. Lydia met her gaze steadily. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only a deep, aching sadness for the woman who had loved her son so little that she had destroyed her own legacy trying to erase his final act of love. The magistrate's voice cut through the silence. "The will of Jonathan Rutledge is hereby upheld in its entirety, with the trust provision now in full effect. This matter is concluded." The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed like thunder. Lady Eleanor stood motionless for a moment longer, then turned and walked from the courtroom, her solicitors scrambling to follow. She did not look back. Lydia remained seated, Robert's hand on her shoulder, Mr. Ainsworth's quiet words of congratulation washing over her. Through the window she could see the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds, casting golden light across the street outside. Jonathan had won, and in winning, he had given Lydia not just a fortune, but her voice, her power, and her place in the world that had tried to erase her. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the final day of the hearing. Word had spread through London society like wildfire. The scandal of the Rutledge will had become the most talked-about spectacle of the season. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the air thick with anticipation and the rustle of fine fabrics, as ladies leaned close to whisper behind gloved hands. Lydia sat beside Mr. Ainsworth and Robert, her hands folded in her lap, her blue dress pressed and immaculate. She had slept the night before, truly slept, for the first time since Jonathan's death. The knowledge of the letter, of Jonathan's final provision, had settled in her chest like a warm stone, anchoring her against the storm she knew was coming. Lady Eleanor sat across the aisle, regal and composed in black bombazine, her solicitors flanking her like sentries. Mr. Blackwell stood at the ready, his expression confident, almost smug. He believed he had won. The testimony of the previous days had done its work, casting doubt on Lydia's character, painting her as a calculating social climber who had manipulated a vulnerable man. The magistrate entered, and the room rose as one before settling back into tense silence. He surveyed the courtroom with a weary expression, clearly eager to bring this matter to a close. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the barristers, "I trust we can conclude this hearing today. Mr. Blackwell, you may present your final arguments." Blackwell rose smoothly, arranging his papers with deliberate care. "Your Honor, the testimony presented over the past days has painted a clear picture. Miss Lydia Farnell, regardless of the certificate produced, was a woman of humble origins who saw an opportunity in the late Mr. Jonathan Rutledge and pursued it with singular determination. The so-called marriage certificate, conveniently discovered only after the will was contested, is suspect in its timing and provenance. Furthermore, the will itself was drafted without the knowledge or consent of Mr. Rutledge's family, during a period when he was clearly under the influence of this woman's charms." He paused, letting the words settle. "Your Honor, we do not dispute that Mr. Rutledge may have had genuine affection for Miss Farnell. Young men are often led astray by pretty faces and persuasive words. But to allow a fortune built over 3 centuries to pass into the hands of a child whose legitimacy remains questionable, based on a will written in secret, this would be a grave injustice." Lady Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Lydia saw the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Blackwell continued, "We ask the court to set aside the will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of proper familial consultation. The Rutledge estate should rightfully pass to the surviving members of the family, as tradition and law would dictate." He sat down, and the magistrate turned to Mr. Ainsworth. "Your response, Counselor?" The elderly lawyer rose slowly, his age apparent in the careful way he moved, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He looked at Lady Eleanor for a long moment before speaking. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "my learned colleague has spoken eloquently about tradition, about family, about the proper order of things. But he has failed to address one fundamental truth. Jonathan Rutledge was a free man, of sound mind, who had every legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. The question of undue influence remains," the magistrate said, frowning. "Indeed it does," Mr. Ainsworth agreed, "and I will address it directly." He reached into his case and withdrew the letter, still in its envelope, Jonathan's handwriting clearly visible on the front. "Your Honor, I hold in my hand a letter written by Jonathan Rutledge to me personally, dated the 18th of March, merely 4 days before his tragic death." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Blackwell was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. If such a document existed, it should have been presented earlier." "The letter was sealed with specific instructions," Mr. Ainsworth interrupted calmly. "It was to be opened only in the event of a legal challenge to the will. That condition has been met." He looked at the magistrate. "With the court's permission?" The magistrate leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Proceed." Mr. Ainsworth broke the seal. Though Lydia knew it had already been opened, he had carefully resealed it for this moment, and withdrew the pages. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as he began to read. Jonathan's words filled the space, clear and deliberate, outlining his fear of his family's reaction, his certainty that they would challenge the will, his explicit instructions about the trust provision. With each sentence, Lydia watched the colour drain from Blackwell's face. Lady Eleanor had gone very still, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. When Mr. Ainsworth reached the clause about the irrevocable trust, the provision that granted Lydia sole control of the entire estate the moment the will was contested, the courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to write, spectators gasped and whispered, and Blackwell turned to Lady Eleanor with an expression of dawning horror. The magistrate banged his gavel. "Order! I will have order!" The noise subsided, but the shock remained palpable. Mr. Ainsworth continued reading until he reached the final lines. Jonathan's declaration that he regretted nothing, that his choices had been made in full knowledge and with absolute conviction. When the lawyer finished, he carefully folded the letter and looked directly at Lady Eleanor. "Your Honour, by contesting this will, Lady Eleanor Rutledge has activated the very provision designed to prevent her interference. The estate is no longer merely bequeathed to young Elias. It is now held in an irrevocable trust managed exclusively by Mrs. Lydia Farnell Rutledge until the child reaches his majority. No member of the Rutledge family has any claim, any oversight, or any legal standing to challenge this arrangement." Blackwell was on his feet, his composure shattered. "Your Honour, this cannot be legal. Such a provision is entirely legal," Mr. Ainsworth said coldly. "I drafted it myself, at Mr. Rutledge's explicit instruction. It is airtight, witnessed, and filed with this court as part of the original will documentation." The magistrate took the letter, reading it himself with meticulous care. The silence stretched, agonizing and absolute. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. "This document appears genuine and legally binding. Mr. Rutledge's intent is unmistakable." He turned to Lady Eleanor, who sat frozen, her mask of composure finally cracking. "Lady Rutledge, by contesting your son's will, you have forfeited any remaining claim to influence over his estate. The trust provision is now in effect." Lady Eleanor rose slowly, her face ashen. "You cannot. This is my family's legacy." "It was your family's legacy," the magistrate corrected quietly. "Your son chose to leave it to his son. And you, madam, by refusing to accept his choice, have ensured that his widow, the woman you sought to destroy, now holds complete authority over everything you sought to reclaim." The words landed like blows. Lady Eleanor turned to look at Lydia, and for the first time, there was no fury in her eyes, no contempt, only the hollow devastation of utter defeat. Lydia met her gaze steadily. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only a deep, aching sadness for the woman who had loved her son so little that she had destroyed her own legacy trying to erase his final act of love. The magistrate's voice cut through the silence. "The will of Jonathan Rutledge is hereby upheld in its entirety, with the trust provision now in full effect. This matter is concluded." The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed like thunder. Lady Eleanor stood motionless for a moment longer, then turned and walked from the courtroom, her solicitors scrambling to follow. She did not look back. Lydia remained seated, Robert's hand on her shoulder, Mr. Ainsworth's quiet words of congratulation washing over her. Through the window, she could see the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds, casting golden light across the street outside. Jonathan had won, and in winning, he had given Lydia not just a fortune, but her voice, her power, and her place in the world that had tried to erase her. The morning Lydia moved into Rutledge Manor. The sky was overcast, the gardens still wet with the previous night's rain. She stood at the entrance, Elias in her arms, and looked up at the stone facade that had loomed over her like a judge for so long. It looked different now, not welcoming exactly, but no longer hostile. It was simply a house, old and grand and full of history, waiting for her to decide what it would become. Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, met her at the door. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, her curtsy precise and professional. "Mrs. Farnell Rutledge," she said quietly. "Your rooms have been prepared. The late master's study has been left untouched, as you requested." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." The servants had lined up in the hall, their faces a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. They had served the Rutledge family for years, some for decades. Lydia was an unknown quantity, a disruption to the order they understood. She did not blame them for their wariness. "I know this is a time of great change," Lydia said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I do not intend to upend your lives or your work. This house has stood for 300 years because of people like you who have cared for it with dedication and skill. I hope you will continue to do so." There was a brief silence. Then Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly. "We will, ma'am." Lydia carried Elias up the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The manor felt cavernous and empty, haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of all the lives that had passed through it. She thought of Jonathan walking these halls as a boy, growing up beneath the crushing expectations of legacy and duty. She wondered if he had ever felt at home here, or if he had always been searching for something beyond these walls. The rooms that had been prepared for her were in the east wing, overlooking the rose gardens. Lydia set Elias down on the thick carpet and watched him toddle toward the window, his small hands reaching for the glass. Beyond, the roses were in bloom, their colors muted beneath the grey sky. She had stood in those gardens once, listening to Lady Eleanor's cold pronouncement that she would receive nothing. It felt like a lifetime ago. Over the following weeks, Lydia began to understand the true scope of what Jonathan had left behind. The estate was vast. Properties in Kent and London, investments in railways and shipping, tenant farms that stretched across the countryside. Mr. Ainsworth guided her through the intricacies of management, and Robert helped her navigate the decisions that needed to be made. She learned quickly, driven not by a desire for wealth, but by a fierce determination to be a worthy steward of what Jonathan had entrusted to her. But it was not the manor or the investments that occupied her thoughts in the quiet hours of the evening. It was the memory of Jonathan's words, written in his final letter. "She will teach him that love is not a weakness, but the greatest strength a man can possess." Lydia began to formulate a plan. She called Mr. Ainsworth to the manor on a crisp autumn morning and laid out her proposal. She would establish a foundation in Jonathan's name, dedicated to providing education and opportunities for young people from humble backgrounds, children like she had been, who had potential but lacked the means to pursue it. Scholarships for university, apprenticeships in trades, assistance for families struggling to keep their children in school. Mr. Ainsworth listened carefully, then nodded his approval. "It is a fitting memorial, Mrs. Farnell Rutledge, one that honors both his legacy and his values." The foundation was announced in the spring, and the response was immediate. Letters arrived from across the country, from parents desperate to give their children a better future, from teachers who knew bright students trapped by poverty, from young men and women who had given up hope of anything beyond the circumstances of their birth. Lydia read every letter personally. She saw herself in their words, saw the girl she had been, uncertain and afraid, but dreaming of something more. And she used Jonathan's fortune to answer those dreams, one scholarship at a time, one opportunity at a time. Society watched, of course. There were those who whispered that she was overstepping, that a woman of her origins could not possibly manage such an endeavor with the proper dignity. But there were others, more than she had expected, who quietly approved. Donations arrived from unexpected sources, and invitations began to appear. Not to grand balls, but to charitable events, to meetings of reformers and educators who saw in her work something worth supporting. Lydia accepted some invitations and declined others. She had no interest in reclaiming a place in the society that had scorned her. She had found a different purpose, one that mattered more than acceptance or approval. One evening in late summer, nearly a year after the court hearing, Lydia walked through the rose gardens with Elias. He was nearly 3 now, walking steadily on his own, his dark hair and grey eyes an echo of his father that made her heart ache and soar in equal measure. They stopped at the bench where she and Jonathan had sat the day he proposed, where he had told her that she was worth more than all the Rutledge legacy combined. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy on the warm air. Elias tugged at her skirt, pointing at a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower. "Mama, look!" "I see it, darling," Lydia said softly, lifting him onto the bench beside her. She looked out at the manor, its windows glowing with the golden light of sunset, and thought of all that had changed. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had stood in these gardens, trembling beneath the weight of Lady Eleanor's condemnation. She was no longer afraid of the judgment of people who had never known her, never valued her. She had fought for her son's inheritance, and she had won. But more than that, she had found her own voice, her own strength, her own understanding of what mattered. Jonathan had given her more than a fortune. He had given her the means to transform pain into purpose, to turn the cruelty she had endured into compassion for others who suffered as she had. He had believed she was strong enough to carry his legacy, and in believing it, he had made it true. Elias nestled against her side, and Lydia wrapped her arm around him, holding him close. The manor behind them was no longer a monument to old money and rigid tradition. It was a home, a foundation, a place where love had triumphed over pride. She did not need society's approval. She had something far more valuable: her son's future, secure and bright, and Jonathan's eternal respect, proven in every word of the will that had changed her life. The butterfly lifted from the rose and fluttered away into the twilight. Lydia watched it go, then looked down at Elias, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, safe and loved. "We did it," she whispered to Jonathan, to the memory that lived in every stone of the manor, in every bloom of the garden. "We did it." And in the settling dusk, surrounded by roses and the quiet promise of tomorrow, Lydia Farnell Rutledge finally allowed herself to rest. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.